Oh, that's good, yeah. One of the pastors back in the 90s, he started that off every time. Am I on? Am I on? I said to a couple of people this week, I've just stopped looking at so many of the posts about it, because it's just overwhelming, and it can actually affect your emotional stability. You can become fearful, anxious, and all the rest of it. But I really gave it some thought during the week, because it's a serious issue. And I can remember over my lifetime, and when reading history books, there was always a clear, simple statement that encapsulated everything that's going on in a particular period. And one popped up not so long ago, and I think it was on one of our chat sites. And it just, for me, exposed the total inanity of what we've been going through for the last 18 months. And I've asked Eric to make it up, and this is it. Do you get it? The protected need to be protected from the unprotected by forcing the unprotected to use the protection that didn't protect the protected. And I think, and I just thought that was just sheer brilliance, because it distills everything that we've been going through for 18 months, just in that one statement. And as I said in the prayer when we opened up, but God, and I'm waiting on him to show his power and his presence. Now, a lovely lady here in the congregation gave me a book to read last week, and it was all about how communism got a hold of Russia in 1917, and then how it got a hold of Eastern Europe after World War II. And it's an absolutely fascinating book, because it's all about Christian, what was the type of Christian, it's not protesters, dissidents, sorry, about Christian dissidents behind the Iron Curtain. And, it's looking very much like, unless God intervenes, we're going to have to develop some of the skills that they developed in living behind the Iron Curtain as Christians. And it was a fascinating book, because it was written by a young man who was the child of parents who escaped from Czechoslovakia while it was under communist rule. And when they, and others like them from Czechoslovakia, went to America in the early 70s, the parents began to get dismayed and somewhat anxious, because through the media, through the culture, through the television, through the articles in newspapers, well-respected newspapers, they could see the same dialogue going on in America that was going on in the countries in Eastern Europe before World War II, because communism was trying to push westward from Russia, and they had infiltrators everywhere. And at the moment, one of the things that really impressed me was that true Christians never gave up. What they did is they developed abilities to maintain their faith and maintain fellowship while they were under the jackboot of communism. And unless but God comes to Australia, I think we're going to have to develop some similar strategies for maintaining our faith and maintaining fellowship if Dastardly Dan and the rest of them have their way. It's just becoming ridiculous. And, they're making protest illegal, they're making even opinions contrary to the government line illegal, and you'll be fined something like $10,980 if you post online anything that is contrary to the official government line. And it's just beyond belief. And yet what they did behind the Iron Curtain is they formed small cell groups that could meet inconspicuously together during the week without drawing attention, and came in together. So churches broke into cell groups and by location encouraged one another and instilled in one another a faith that this darkness will pass. And believe me, this darkness will pass. Evil empires have never, ever, ever lasted. And they've fallen, and there's been what I call an Indian summer, and then given human nature, they'll start up again at some time. But we're in the last days. I'm telling you, we're in the last days. And this time that we're living in now is profoundly different to every other time that we've had to put up with, because evil has a technology that was never available before. But we have the same God that Moses had when he was confronted by the Egyptian army when they were on the shores of the Red Sea. And when Abraham went off with his 370 men and beat the living daylights out of 5 Aramaean kings, every time that people of faith have needed God, he's turned up. And sometimes it's always at the last moment. Don't you hate that? You want him to be early to minimise anxiety. But he's not like that, because this is a training and a testing time. And this is a time that I really feel is going to, through the sifting process, is they're going to reveal genuine Christians and fake Christians. Because fake Christians are churchians. They'll attend church to look good, but real Christians take the encouragement that we get from meeting together like this home with them during the week, and it's the food and the nourishment and the fellowship that keeps us going till the next time we meet. And all of these things that are in us who are true Christians are coming out in today's message, because it's Matthew 5, 1-12, it's the Beatitudes. And I just want to say this, Matthew 5, 6 and 7, it's well known as the Sermon on the Mount, but that's the only thing that has any relevance to what is actually in the message. There are 3 chapters that are recorded in Matthew 5, 6 and 7. There are some allusions to it in Luke chapter 6, but that only goes to prove that this wasn't the only time that Jesus preached these principles to his disciples. And the key verse in this whole discourse is Matthew 5:20. If I can have, that's it. For Jesus said to them, "For I say to you that unless your righteousness exceeds the righteousness of the scribes and Pharisees, you will by no means enter into the kingdom of heaven." You can't get halfway in. You can't get a toe over the threshold. You can't. You're either in the kingdom or you're out of the kingdom. It's that straightforward. You're either in or out. And Jesus is saying something to the people of first century Israel that absolutely amazed them, because the scribes and Pharisees were absolute experts at putting out the front of religiosity. And this is the problem that has plagued Judaism. We don't have time to go into today, but since Ezra and the scribes came back from Babylon after they were released by Artaxerxes Longimanus, they came back to Israel, and Ezra led the scribes in an examination of how this tragedy happened, that Israel was kicked out of its land. And so what they did, in the strength of their own flesh, they came up with hundreds and then eventually thousands of regulations that they parked around the outside of the Mosaic law. For they said that we must never ever get to that stage again when we start breaking and trashing the Mosaic law. And so they came up with all of these regulations, and you can see them in the Talmud. And what it was a human way of trying to protect God's righteousness. Because God's righteousness was in the Mosaic law, you just had to look for it. Because everyone tries to, when they look at rules and regulations, not only back then, but even now, I can remember Arnold Fruchtenbaum when he became a messianic believer in Jesus, Yeshua the Messiah. He went to one church in New York, and I think it would probably have been a Lutheran or something. And in the lobby, they had a whole list of regulations that you had to obey in order to become a member to that church. All right? You couldn't smoke, you couldn't drink, you couldn't go to beaches with mixed genders, do you know what I mean? The blokes had to go down to the beach one Sunday, the ladies would go down the next. There was list after list after list after list. And one of the elders came up to Arnold from the church and said, "I bet you're so pleased to be free from under the law." And Arnold just looked at him and just walked off, you know. And it's in us, it's in our carnality that we think that we make regulations and rules that seem to imply righteousness, but unless, as Jesus said, unless your righteousness that you're claiming exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, you're not getting into heaven. And one of the things that the scribes and Pharisees, over that 400-year period between Ezra coming back and Jesus' first advent, they had so perverted the Mosaic law that they had come up with a theology that said that every single physical descendant of Abraham, that is every genuine Jew, had an automatic entrance into heaven simply by being a physical descendant of Abraham. And how did they come up with that? Well, we'll look at that passage here because it says that in Genesis 15, Abraham believed God, and it was credited to him as righteousness. And so the scribes and Pharisees came up with this weird theology that Abraham had so much righteousness in him that there was enough left over for every successive generation of Jews. You can't make that stuff up. This is a Don Stewart type of thing. You know, you could not, if you lived to be as old as Methuselah, who was who? How old? 969 years, right. If you lived 969 years and you tried every day to be good, you're still not going to get into heaven. Do you understand? Because the only way you get into heaven is to attain the standard of God's righteousness. And as carnal Christians, we can't do that. Carnal human beings, we can't do that. Why? Because anything that we come up with in ourselves is part and parcel of our fallen nature. We might want to do good, look good, sound good, but it's not good enough. What we need is God's righteousness, because that's the standard that he sets for you to be returned into a relationship with him. And how do you get his righteousness? One way. You put your faith, believe, and trust in Jesus Christ and what he did on the cross for you. Do you know what? It's not a collegial thing. It's not a group exoneration. He died for every single one of you. Not group, not large assembly. He died for every single one of you. He took the bullet that was meant for you and me. And because we put our faith and trust and belief in him, what he did on the cross for you and I, then we have his righteousness imputed to us. It's like we put on his robe of righteousness. And that makes us acceptable to God our Father. Do you understand? That is the only way you'll ever attain to a standard of righteousness that allows you to be restored to a relationship with your Father in heaven. That's the only way. And I've seen people and talked with people over the last 30 years that have said, I've actually lived quite a good life. I don't think I've done too many bad things. So Christianity suits me. Do you know what I mean? I've met them. I've talked with them. I've been in Bible studies with them. I've been in home groups with them. People who assume that they're not very bad people. They must be good enough to qualify for the kingdom of heaven. Well, we're going to look at some things today that just prove that that's not true. And I'm going to address the last two verses of Matthew 4, which is 24 and 25, because it leads into what we're seeing here. And this is the reason why he had a multitude there. And also, he had also had his 12 disciples that he had picked. One of the things you must understand, Matthew is a very Jewish book, and it is not sequential. Jewish people, because of their Semitic conceptual minds, they don't do things neatly and tidily in order like we do. The only gospel writer that ever laid claim to setting out an orderly account of Jesus' ministry was who? Luke, because he was writing to most excellent Theophilus. And he said, I have read many accounts and I have set forth an orderly account, most excellent Theophilus, of a record of Jesus' ministry. Mark, Matthew, and John have no claims of such sequential order. And so this is one of the fascinating things, because Jesus actually in Matthew chapter 10 chose his 12 disciples, and it's there in one of these Beatitudes why he chose them. But can you remember in Luke 10, he sent out 70 of his disciples? Do you remember that? He sent them out 2 by 2 with instructions. And from that 70, he distilled down to 12 people that suited one of the Beatitudes there that we're going to look at. And in verse 24 of chapter 4, it says, Then his fame, Jesus' fame, went throughout all of Syria, and they brought to him all sick people who were afflicted with various diseases and torments, and those who were demon-possessed, epileptics, paralytics, and he healed them. Verse 25, and great multitudes followed him from Galilee, from Decapolis, Jerusalem, Judea, and beyond the Jordan. And you know what? They were there for what they could get out of Jesus. And it's so common in human nature. I have, like these other people that I've met in churches over the last 32 years, there's people who get this sort of joy. And they say, I've joined a church and I think I'm a Christian. And you get a testing. You get a trial. Do you remember your trials the moment you became a Christian? You thought it was just going to be a carpet ride to heaven. And all of a sudden you hit a few potholes in the road along the way. And I've had guys say to me at the end of a service in a 1,000-strong church, I never signed up for this, I'm out of here. Because the trial and the testing came. And it's the sifting that's going on right now in the church right around the Western Hemisphere. It's the testing to see if you have genuine faith in Jesus Christ. Because we're all going to go through trials and tests. And, we'll come out shining at the other end. It's amazing. And so these people here wanted his carnal provision, not Jesus' carnal, but their solution to their problems. Do you understand? And it was this kind of attitude that brought about this kind of discourse, and it's called the Sermon on the Mount, but it's really about 3 different things. And the 3 different things is this. Firstly, Matthew chapter 5 is defined by one statement, and the statement is this. Jesus says to the disciples, you have heard that it was said, but I say it is written. And I'd love to know how many of you really understand that statement. Because what Jesus is doing is tearing down the whole concept of an oral law. Because what Ezra and the scribes after that when they came up with all of these additional regulations that Jewish people had to observe. I mean, I think it's in Exodus, I forget now, it's so long since I've done it. I used to teach this years ago. There is a half a verse in Exodus, I'm just trying to find, Sue would know what it is, where God says to the Jewish people, you are not to seethe the kid in its mother's milk. Do you understand that? Do you remember that? You are not to seethe the kid in its mother's milk. And the reason why God said that to the Israelite people is that's what the Canaanites did as worship to Baal. Do you understand? They would take the firstling of a flock, usually a goat, and they would have a collected amount of its mother's milk, and they would boil the kid in its mother's milk as an offering to Baal. Do you understand? So what did the Jews do with that? What they did, they came up with the kosher dietary laws, which my poor wife has had to put up with for 25 years. And boy, the first time we had Jewish guests around for lunch, some lovely old ladies from the home, Sue made a shepherd's pie, all right? Beautiful, I love it. I love Sue's shepherd pies. But they wouldn't eat it. And Sue said, is there something wrong with it? And they said, dear, you've put cheese on the top and you can't mix dairy products with meat. Do you see what I mean? And so Sue sort of got this sort of spatula thing and sort of scraped the cheese off the thing, and that was fine. But you see, this is what happened when God said you must not seethe the kid in its mother's milk. You cannot have a meat and a dairy product together in the same meal. In fact, you can't even have them on the same plate. And if you how many of you have been into an Orthodox Jewish home here in Perth or anywhere? You ever seen the kitchens? They're fascinating. Costs them a fortune. Because you can stand in the middle, say this is the kitchen, you stand in the middle and they're a mirror image of each other. The same crockery is in the drawers on that side that are in the drawers on that side. The same cutlery is in the drawers that side, the same cutlery in the drawers that side. There's a fabulous fridge over there, a wonderful fridge over there. There's an oven over there and there's an oven over there. It's a mirror image. And all of that side is for meat, and all of this side is for dairy. And never the twain shall meet. It is. It's just amazing. And we were at one of these homes one night, and they had given me a cup of tea. It was a very nice cup of tea, but it had milk in it. So I did what I normally do when I'm out. I pick up my cup and saucer and I take it into the kitchen and put it on the counter, you see. I don't expect people to wait after me. Well, this poor woman screamed after me and says, no, no. I said, what? It's supposed to be on this counter, this one over here. That's what humans do when they come up with their own religion. Do you see what I mean? They don't read this, they make it up in here. And it becomes a burden that weighs people down. And there is no joy in that religion, there's no happiness in that religion, there's no fulfillment in that religion, because you're always trying to keep the regulations. Matthew 11, Jesus says, come to me, all of you who are heavy laden and weary, for my yoke is light and easy. And that is what Jesus is saying to all of these people. And in chapter 5, verse 1, and seeing the multitudes, he went up on a mountain, and when he was seated, his disciples came to him. And then he opened his mouth and taught them. Do you understand? He taught them, the disciples. This was not for the multitudes. This is for the training of the disciples to become the pillar and foundation of the future church that only he knew about. So he's saying this. I'm going to read them through, and I want to show you all of them together because the structure is absolutely fascinating. Verse 3, blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Verse 4, blessed are those who mourn, for they shall be comforted. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. That really got me. When I was first a Christian, and I was reading the Beatitudes and doing a study on the Beatitudes in the early 90s, I looked at that and said, how did the wimps get the earth? How did they get it? which showed my complete and utter ignorance of the Greek word that is translated meek. And I'm going to tell you what meek means this morning or this afternoon. And verse 6, for blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. 7, blessed are the merciful, for they shall obtain mercy. And blessed are the pure in heart, for they shall see God. Blessed are the peacemakers, for they shall be called the sons of God. And verse 10, blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. And I want, the guys have done all of this, and I want you to understand something. And this is David Hocking. I really like him. He can become very bombastic at times. Have any of you ever listened to David Hocking? No, he's very, very good. Sometimes. Most of the time. And he's very good with Greek. And I learn a lot from him. Some of the things he goes wonky with. He's totally and utterly opposed to alcohol. His dear Lord never let a drop of alcohol ever pass his divine lips. And Arnold Fruchtenbaum says, well, that's strange. How did he go to a Passover or a Jewish wedding? Do you see what I mean? And the problem with Dave is that at one stage, when we had Amir and Barry Stagner over here a couple of years ago, I was driving Barry Stagner around Perth before Amir got here. And he had Dave Hocking teach one of the midweek nights at his church. And at one stage, he got up to 400 pound in weight. And then Barry said to me, no, he's come back down to 250 pound in weight because of a diet. And Dave used to boast on his teachings that after he had finished teaching in the morning, he'd go home in the afternoon and put on some pap TV, things that was just mindless, that didn't make you have to think, but he would sit down with a gallon of Ben & Jerry's ice cream. So I looked at the 7 deadly sins that the Catholics came up with, and I see one of them beginning with G in there. So I can't reconcile the fact that, alcohol is terrible, but gluttony is perfectly okay. And, it just doesn't make sense. But it just shows you that every single person who has ever been really deeply immersed in Christian theology, it fascinates me. Because as they get older, I think what happens in their minds, they become possessed with the desire to be known for a special thing that they came up with. Do you know what I mean? And, there was Bob Team, who I really like. There's some people here who have listened to Bob Team. In his dotage, in his last few years of teaching, he came up with some weird teaching on the blood of Jesus Christ, that it had magical properties and things like that. And you get to the stage where some of these guys in their last years of ministry, you say, no, you're going on too long. You should stop, retire, enjoy, smell the roses and relax, because what they do is they go out of beyond acceptable theology. And so what we're going to do here, so chapter 5 is, you have heard that it was said, oral law, but I say it is written, the Mosaic law. Why? Because the oral law changes generation after generation after generation. And I have had Jewish people get really angry with me when I've said to them, do you know there's no such thing as the oral law? Well, you might as well bring a pork chop in for tea. Because their rabbis have told them that there's an oral law. There is no oral law. There is the written law, the Mosaic law, 613 commandments that you can read and judge your own behaviour according to what is written. If we had the same standards in Christianity, and there are a lot of people trying to do that, liberal so-called pastors in America at the moment saying we need to unhitch ourselves from the Old Testament because it's completely irrelevant to Christianity. Well, that's like having a dinner table with no legs. It's sitting on the floor. How on earth would you know what the point of Jesus Christ coming in the first advent without knowing what happened in the Garden of Eden in Genesis chapter 3? What would you wouldn't understand. And I have heard blasphemy after blasphemy after blasphemy in modern liberal Christianity that trash this book and reinterpret what it says to suit carnal desires, and they're no different from the Pharisees of 2,000 years ago. There is nothing new under the sun. We always come into the company of people who will try and modify faith to suit them rather than modifying themselves to suit God. Do you understand? It's amazing. And so I'm going to look at, sorry, can I have the 10 of them? Brilliant. Right. There's some very interesting thing here. Look at verse 3. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs what? Is. Present tense. Present tense, aorist tense means forever. Theirs is the kingdom of God. Look down at verse 10. Blessed are those who are persecuted for righteousness' sake, for theirs is. But look what is there in between both of those verses. We have shall be, shall inherit, shall be, shall obtain, shall see, shall be. For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. Do you understand? There's a structure to this little list of Beatitudes that is absolutely fascinating. I'm the kind of person that swims in that, wallows in it. I just love it. And Sue said to me, when she saw about 15 pages of notes, keep it simple. You went on too long last week. And I said, I did too. The Catholics nearly threw a chair at me. So I'm watching the clock, you know what I mean? But there's so much in here, so much in here. The first one in verse 3 and in verse 10 are the bookends of what goes on in between. Do you understand? And so I'm going to start here. Blessed are the poor in spirit, for theirs is the kingdom of heaven. What does poor in spirit actually mean? Anyone know what the word poor in Greek is? There's two words that are used for poor or poverty in the Greek. One is penes, P-E-N-E-S, and the other one is patokos, and it describes two forms of poverty. If you are a pene, a poor person described in that way, what happens to you is that you can scratch out a living each and every day just in order to live, but you've got absolutely nothing left over. Do you understand? So you can scratch out a living. That's a poor person because they can't accumulate funds, they can't accumulate any money for an emergency. They simply live day by day, but it's by their own labour. The other word in the Greek is patokos, which means utter and absolute poverty. Utter and absolute poverty. You are totally and utterly unable to provide for yourself. And who remembers Luke 16? The tale of Lazarus and the rich man. Do you remember that? Lazarus was a patokos. Lazarus was so sick, so poor, so bereft of any assets whatsoever, and also very sick, that his friends in desperation brought Lazarus along. And by the way, this is a true tale. This is not a parable. There is never a person's proper name ever in any parable. This is something that I guarantee you that Jesus stuck at them, because this would have happened in Jewish society during their time. And they would have remembered what happened to these two people. And so their friends brought Lazarus, patokos, absolutely in complete mendacity, and dropped him and put him down outside the gate, the entrance to the rich man's house, hoping and praying that the rich man in his excess would help Lazarus. And what happened? He didn't. I've saved $1 million over the last 10 years. I'm just going to start to save the next $1 million. And then I'll save the next $1 million. How many of you know really wealthy people? Sue and I do. I've never met a happy, wealthy person. Why? Because whatever they've got is never enough. If you give them $1 million, they'll want 10. If you give them 10 million, they'll say, why didn't you give me 20? If you give them 20 million, they'll say, oh, I could really do really big things with 100 million. It's never enough. Do you remember that famous anecdote? One of the richest men in America, Randolph Hearst, got off a ship in San Francisco, and a reporter went up to him and said, Mr. Hearst, you know that you're one of the wealthiest men, not only in America, but in the world. Mr. Hearst, how much is enough money? And Randolph said, just a little bit more, son. Just a little bit more. It's never enough. It never, ever satisfies. And you know what? When you've got a lot of money, you spend 99% of your time trying to protect it, trying to keep it, trying to increase it, and life just passes you by. Life passes you by. So Lazarus was Patokos, but he was a believer. And when the two of them died, I think this is fascinating. I don't know if you've ever picked up on this. This is absolutely fascinating. That when Lazarus died, 2 angels took him to the bosom of Abraham, the nice part of down there waiting for Jesus. Do you know what I mean? Because it's the same place that Jesus said to the thief on the cross, he wasn't a thief, he was an insurrectionist. You didn't get crucified for theft in those days. It was far too expensive. You either got or chopped. So he was an insurrectionist, and he said to the one on the right who believed in him, said, Lord, remember me when you come into your kingdom, remember that? And Jesus turned to him and said, I promise you this day you will be with me in paradise, which is the bosom of Abraham down below, which is where Lazarus ended up. Where did the rich man end up? In torment in hell. And all of a sudden, that rich man looked and said, Father Abraham. Now, how did he know it was Abraham? Because people are identifiable even in the spirit realm. When the witch of Endor pulled up Samuel at King Saul's behest, she screamed. She knew it was Samuel, but he came up in a spirit entity. The Mount of Transfiguration in Matthew, we're going to get up to that. That's brilliant. So you've got John, Peter, and James with Jesus on the Mount of Transfiguration. Who turns up? 2 people turn up, Moses and Elijah, and the disciples recognize them. I think that's fascinating. People have said to me, what am I going to look like in heaven? Well, I've got good news and bad news, pretty much like you do now, you know. I can see some people are very disappointed. One of the, I used to run the night service at a church up in Ranford Road, and I was doing Revelation at this time and all the rest of it. And one of the lovely ladies called Brenda said to me, Stuart, do we get the same body in heaven? And I said, yeah, it's probably going to be, a bit slimmer. And I said, why? She said, I'm sick and tired of being short. And so she was hoping for a vertical extension. My wife would rather, a couple of inches chopped off. Do you know what I mean? No one's ever satisfied. It's amazing. So this is blessed are the poor in spirit. What does that mean theologically? that you come to an understanding, because this is to Jewish people in the first century, their only standard of righteousness was the Mosaic law. And these people have been trying to keep the 613 commandments, have never had any success, have had to continually offer up sacrifices in order to atone for their sin. And so they get to the stage where they cry out to God, I can't meet your standard. So how do I get into heaven? And there was a promise of a coming Messiah as far back as Genesis 3:15. Do you understand? It was the seed of the woman. And they knew that a deliverer was coming. Why did Job 4,000 years ago declare in 19:25 and 26, I know that my Redeemer lives, and that he shall stand on the earth at the end of the age, and that even though worms destroy this physical body, yet in my flesh, my resurrected flesh, I will see him. He knew that 4,000 years ago. It's one of these things that are inferred in the Bible and never explained. You just have to work on it and believe in it, and you can ask your questions when you get up there. I'm sure you've got a litany of angels with all of their notes ready to answer all of your questions. But we're supposed to get most of them down here by investigating what's in these scriptures. So poor in spirit is realizing that you cannot do it yourself. So what you do is you cry out to Jesus. You cry out to him and say, I can't do it. You'll have to do it for me. And what does he say from 2,000 years ago? I've already done it. What did you do, Jesus? I died in your place. And God accepted that, and through the resurrection is a stamp of approval from divine authority that Jesus has paid for your sin. Tetelestai, it's all been done. So when you get to that realization that you can't save yourself, this is the poverty of spirit, you then have to realize that God has to do it for you. And what's the outcome of that? For theirs is the kingdom of heaven. It's already yours. You're not going to get it at some later date. Revelation 13, there's a book, Lamb's Book of Life, that was written before the foundation of this earth. Who here is a born-again believer in Jesus Christ? Right, your names were in it back then. They didn't wait until you got saved. It was written in before the foundation of this earth. Do you understand? Why? Because God's omniscient. God wasn't surprised on the day that you put your faith in Jesus Christ. He knew from the very beginning. If he didn't know from the very beginning, he couldn't claim to be omniscient. He is omniscient. He knows everything. 2 atoms can collide in the Andromeda constellation, and God knows about it. Do you understand? And we can never, ever fully understand that. But God knows everything, and he knows you, and he knew you from the beginning right until now. He knew that you would be here this afternoon. He knew that Kat and Josh would lead us in worship. And you'll have to come back every 6 months, seriously. Yep, they've put their hand up for that. But he knows everything. And he knows that you cannot save yourself, and he wants you to realize that. That is the poverty in the spirit, where you finally realize that God has to do it for me. The second one, blessed are those who mourn. And the word there is pantheos. It means to lament. Lament when you recognize that even though you're saved, you still sin. You mourn over the fallen state that is still within you, recognizing that there is a new you in you. Ephesians 4:24, put off the old man and put on what? The new man. They both exist within you. Every Christian is a schizophrenic. Do you understand that? You can go that way, or you can go that way according to every decision you have to make on every day of your life. And it depends on who wins the whisper. I can remember this teaching last year. Chuck Missler had this. On your left shoulder, you got a little black dog, and on your right shoulder, you got a little white dog. And when you come up with a decision, little black dog goes, come on, be naughty. You know you like it. And the little white dog's going, oh no, you can't do that. You must be righteous, all right? So you have to listen to the voice that is within you. And I hope, according to progressive sanctification, that you're making more good decisions than you were 10 years ago. That's called progressive sanctification. As far as God is concerned, you're already sanctified because in Ephesians 2, 1-9, you're already seated in heavenly places with him in Christ Jesus. Do you understand that? You're already there. God is outside of time. God doesn't look back to yesterday or forward to tomorrow. God knows everything at all times because he's outside of time, and you and I can't grasp that. We live in 3.5 dimensions, width, height, and depth, and half a dimension of time. Why? Because we can't remember tomorrow and we can't look forward to yesterday. Do you understand? We do not have any comprehension of what we're going to be like when we're up there with him, because we will live in 10 dimensions, which is the dimensionality that Adam and Eve lived in before they fell. Why? Because God himself would come down every day in the cool of the evening and fellowship with them. With them. Remember last year when we had Brian Osborne from Answers in Genesis here? And he proved conclusively that there was no death until the fall of Adam. And Romans says that. Death came by one man. So nothing died before Adam sinned. And you get people who, I'm not a million-year, billion-year, old earth age person, but I do get very frustrated with people who are not that sharp, that say they just term it in 7 days. And I know what everything else says. But if you're going to tell me that on the 6th day when Adam was created and Eve was created later, if you're having a 12-hour daylight day and a 12-hour night, how are they going to achieve everything that they achieved in that short time? I am not arguing for an old earth existence. That's a load of rubbish. What I'm saying is we have no idea of what time dimensionality existed before Adam fell. And I'll tell you why it's true, because that'll be the same conditions that we live in the New Jerusalem and the new heavens and the new earth, because there's no yesterday or tomorrow in eternity. We'll be living with our Father in heaven in eternity. Do you understand? There is no time. You're not, you know that lovely hymn, Amazing Grace? I think it's the 4th stanza, when we've been there 10,000 years, bright shining like the sun, right? There's no such thing as 10,000 years in eternity. There isn't. There is no time in eternity, it's the ever-present now. And people struggle to grasp that, struggle to grasp it. And that's why the ancient rabbis said it was blasphemy to try and exegete Genesis 1 into what we call Genesis 1 and 2. Why? Because we didn't fully understand what was happening there, and we will never understand quite what it's like in Revelation 21 and 22, because there is a dimensionality, there's a reality that we can't grasp in our present bodies. And I'll tell you, there's a hint of it. Remember when the 6 of the 11 disciples are locked in a room, and they're all discussing, trying to convince Thomas that Jesus is risen again. And what happens? Jesus walks through walls and doors into a locked room. You want to see me try? You can't do it. You can't do it in this dimensionality. Jesus did. Why? Because he's already in the next order that we're in. He walked through solid walls. They're nothing to him in that dimensionality. And, you know, I've always wondered why people speculate on what their mansion's going to look like in heaven. Because if you're in that kind of body, why do you need an apartment? Sue says to sleep. You don't get tired. It's an amazing thing. You have to understand, this whole concept. And those who are mourning because they still occasionally sin. Anyone occasionally sin last 7 days? By thought, word, or deed? Anyone didn't? We should mourn. I get very upset with myself when I let myself down in front of him. And I had 4 trips down the Tonkin Highway this last week for a man I'm looking after in Armidale Hospital, and I loathe that Tonkin Highway with a passion. It is, you come up to the Welshpool lights, kilometre of cars waiting. You come up to the Kelvin Road lights, another kilometre of... It's just insane. It's insane. And I have to say, in all honesty, because the angels were listening, I was not happy at certain drivers on the road. But I do feel I mourned for my sin, do you know what I mean? But I had to get over it. Here's the other one. This is the one I really love. Blessed are the meek, for they shall inherit the earth. And what does meek mean? What does meek mean? Yeah, gentle. Someone's just said gentle. Other people say quiet confidence, things like that. What does meek mean? Getting closer. I've got, for my birthday, Buzz Lightyear at the back there gave me 2 tiles. You know what tiles are? They're little square things, and you put them... I've got one in my wallet and one attached to my car keys. And at least once every 2 days, I've lost either. So I can get my phone out and push either wallet or keys, and I walk around the house. And it says, getting stronger, and getting stronger. It is the best gift you can give an old person. Seriously. So she's getting closer, obedient. I'll tell you what praotes is. When Alexander the Great took over the kingdom from his father, Philip of Macedon, when he was 16 years of age, he got very frustrated because he had 4 city-states, Athens, Sparta, Corinth, and what was the other one? Sparta. Did I say Sparta? Yeah, there's 4 of them. There's actually 5 quoted, but one is Thebes, which was down in Egypt, doesn't count. And what they did is they all spoke a different vernacular of common or classic Greek. Do you understand? And when Alexander was with his generals on a mountaintop looking at the divisions of his army, Alexander would give an order to his generals, and they had to reinterpret it to their subordinates and get each divisions of the army to act as one in concert. And Alexander just went nuts over this because it just took too long. Because he had studied the Persian army, which was a 2 million man army, and it was mighty, but it was very slow. And that was its ultimate downfall. So the genius of Alexander the Great was that he came up with what's called Koine Greek. And Koine is just the word for common. It's common Greek. So he made everyone learn this common language. And as Dave Hocking says, it's the largest, most mathematically precise language ever developed by human beings. And if you know Greek, you shouldn't ever preach something wrong because it's so precise, and if you understand it, then you will preach what is the truth in the New Testament. And the fascinating thing was that when Alexander came up with this, everyone attributes him a kind of genius for coming up with that language. It wasn't his genius. God knew what the New Testament would be written in, so he enabled genius inside Alexander to produce the language that he was going to use, Paul and the other apostles, to write down the doctrines that you and I live by. Do you understand? He was in control. You might look at Alexander the Great, but it wasn't. It was God in control and bringing about the Greek language. And the amazing thing here is when he was developing his strategy against Persia, he realized that their slowness was their weakness. And so he had to develop an army that was lightning fast. And remember in Daniel chapter 7, this one's Daniel 11, the Greek army, in the list of animals, you had a lion, a bear, a leopard, and a horrible-looking thing, which is the fourth kingdom, which is what we're under now, by the way. But the Greek Empire was the leopard. Why? Because it moved with extreme speed. You know, in 17 years, Alexander went from being king of a little tin pot place called Greece to having an empire that spread to northern India in 16 or 17 years. And he died in Babylon at the age of 33 from syphilis because he had nothing else to do. And it's just amazing. When you have achieved everything in the human realm, you realise how empty it is. And his attendant says, well, who do we give the kingdom to? And he said, give it to the strong. Give it to the strong. And so 4 generals split it up between them, Cassander, Lysimachus, Ptolemy, and Seleucus. And they ended up fighting with each other. But the brilliant thing about the Greek language, and especially this one, and when I was studying this back in the early 90s, remember Coorong was down in Leederville? There, remember that? And they had those little wooden boxes out the front with all the cheapos that no one would buy. Well, I bought one called Dick Easton's Dictionary of the Word. And you can just see God. In Isaiah 50 verse 4, it says that my Father awakened me morning by morning and gave me the tongue of disciples. And that is a messianic passage in Isaiah 50 verse 4. Do you see what I mean? And we are told that there is nothing about Jesus' childhood in the scriptures. Rubbish. Look for it. It's there. Because morning by morning, God, his heavenly Father, used to wake him up and teach him everything he had to know as a human being. Do you understand? And that's in that Isaiah 50 verse 4 passage. And it says he gave him the tongue of a disciple. What does a disciple do? A disciple asks a teacher a question and uses the answer to pass on that information to someone else. Do you understand? That's what the 12 apostles did. Not Judas, Matthias. And so there is this brilliant thing here where he told us through the Greek language to understand this particular thing. It's not the wimps that got the world. When Alexander needed this lightning force, he came up with the idea of a cavalry alongside his 35,000 man army. And he got the idea of the cavalry from the Scythians, who had existed for 1,000 years and were famous all over the ancient world as horse-riding soldiers who were incredibly powerful because they were all horse-ridden and they could lightning attack and lightning take away. And that's exactly what Alexander was after to bolster his army. And so what he needed was trained people to go around Greece, and they were looking for special horses to become those cavalry steeds. And they had to look for a horse that had a specific nature. A specific nature. And that nature they determined and described as praotes. So what does praotes mean? To a war horse, to a stallion. And what they used to do in the testing is they used to go up to these horses that were selected to be candidates for the cavalry, and they would create chaos, bang and make shout and scream and clang and do everything. And they would see the ones that were shy up and the ones that would get agitated, they're no good, sent away. And they'd keep banging and clanging and yelling and screaming, and they would finally distill the candidates down to a few horses that stayed there passively despite their circumstances, and they wouldn't move or do anything until the rider on top of them gave them a command. Do you understand? Despite your outward circumstances, they never moved, waiting for the rider to give them an instruction. That's praotes. Because what does it mean? They are able to be trained. That's what it means. And Jesus went from 70 disciples down to 12 because he knew that they could be trained. That's praotes. That's meek. And do you know what the application is for you and I? Despite having as many Bibles as you can want to buy from Koorong, the question is for every one of us, can we be trained? Or can we just live Christianity our way? That's the question for us today. And that's why they inherit the earth. Those who are able to be trained, they can be used by God for his glory. That's praotes. That's meek. I'll try and do one more. You see my wife do that? Just look for flying chairs if I don't stop. In verse 6, I'll do that and we'll finish off now. Blessed are those who hunger and thirst for righteousness, for they shall be filled. And that word for righteousness there is diakosune, and it actually means an absolute standard of righteousness. And it goes back to the second one where it says the poor in spirit in verse 3, because you have to hunger and thirst after God's righteousness, because you cannot provide your own. And that's the whole teaching of these Beatitudes. Everything in these Beatitudes are in the passive voice in the Greek. What does that mean? There are three tenses, verb tenses. There's active, neutral, and passive. And all of these are in the passive voice. Why? Because God is doing everything for you. The word blessed here, makarios, is very simple. Everyone says it's happy. It means happy. It doesn't mean happy. Happy is a derivative of an old English word called happenstance. And it means hap, circumstance. So if you have just won lotto, what are you going to be? Happy initially and then miserable because it wasn't enough. All right? But let's start off with happy. All right? You're going to be happy because your circumstances have just provided you with some kind of provision. But what happens if you're desperate for the money, you bought the ticket and you get nothing? What are you? You're miserable and you're fearful and you say, well, where am I going to get it from if I can't get it from those 6 numbers? Give me a break. Hap has nothing to do with blessedness. I'm going to finish here. Blessedness is what you receive from God. The moment you put your faith and trust in Jesus, makarios means the absolute standard of righteousness. And what happens is God gives you an inner peace and joy knowing that you are saved, that you have a destiny in heaven, that when you either die or go up in the rapture, you're going to be in his presence forever. So regardless of your circumstances, whether you win or you lose, you still have that inner peace and joy. That's what salvation does for you. It takes you out of the carnal and puts you into the spiritual. And when you hunger and thirst for it, you're already a born-again believer. Every one of these people here, this is the attributes of a born-again believer. When you hunger and thirst for God's righteousness, it's called progressive sanctification. You start to grow in the grace and the knowledge of the Lord Jesus Christ. You start to look like him. Because in Romans 8, our destiny is this, to be conformed into the image of his Son, Jesus. We're not going to look like him, but we'll think, speak, and act like him in the millennial kingdom and in the eternal state. Do you understand? And that is what this is all about. The Beatitudes. Things that you have been given by God without merit, by his favor and his love for you. You didn't have a single thing to offer him in exchange. Not a thing. Why did he pick us? I don't know. Don't start me on the doctrine of election. That starts fistfights between theologians. You've got a Calvinist and an Arminian, and you've got the best people of all, the Bereans, right in the middle. We're Bereans. We search the scriptures daily to see what they say, and we receive it with all openness of mind. And if you're already made up what the scripture should say, you're not a Berean. And this is a church full of Bereans. Father, we come before you this afternoon, and we've only just started to scratch what's in these Beatitudes, Father. But as Jesus says, unless our righteousness exceeds that of the scribes and Pharisees, Father, we would never make it into heaven. But you have given us a cloak of righteousness from Jesus to us because he paid the price that we couldn't. We couldn't atone for our sin. Jesus, Father, did. And that's why we have his righteousness. And so, Father, I ask you this afternoon, and I implore you, Father, that as we see more and more challenges coming towards us in these dark days, I ask you to really impress on everyone here that we have a destiny that is guarded in heaven by you. And we're going to partake in that destiny regardless of what happens on this earth. And so, Father, we just ask you now to bless us as we go through this week. And Father, instill us with a sense of grace and inner peace and joy, knowing that we will soon be with Jesus and with you. And all God's people said,